Alrighty, folks. This morning we have Dr. Brad Doherty. He is a lecturer in honors and religion at Belmont. I took his class my first semester freshman year, and I learned a lot about writing and how to be a student in that class, and it was really good. Dr. Doherty has an emphasis in history, and we are just super excited to have him here with us today. So, without further ado, Dr. Doherty.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all. It's an honor to be with you here this morning. As I understand it, you all have been spending the season of Lent thinking about how we keep time, and particularly about how we keep sacred time. Yeah, that's right. Good. So I am, as Jesse suggested, a church historian by training. And so our time together this morning is going to be spent thinking about this theme historically, and perhaps engaging our historical imaginations a bit, and maybe reflecting a little bit on this, how this might help us inform our own practice. We're going to spend most of our time looking at a couple of particular ways that Christians in the past sought to create and live into a particularly Christian rhythm of life. I'm an Episcopalian. Y'all are Presbyterians, of course. And so I've chosen an example from each of our traditions. We can have a little bit of an ecumenical moment together. Of course, there are lots of different ways to keep time. And I don't think I need to tell you all of that. I assume that all of you are subject to a number of different ways of trying to keep and mark time, ways that are often conflicting, ways that often don't get along. To take a very, very minor example, as a professor, I'm on an academic calendar. I'm also a parent. My children are also on an academic calendar, and it sure would be nice if those calendars line up, and also they don't. I teach in a department of theology, and my work calendar often, as it does this year, at the time of the year when things are ramping up at the end of the spring semester and we are doing finals and turning in final projects and the grading goes up, lo and behold, this is also the most important time of the Christian calendar when I would like to have more time in Lent and Holy Week to be, even though I'm working in a theology department at a Christian university, these two things don't always combine. And those, honestly, I think that for many of us, our time is structured. Those are very mild examples of the ways in which we are subject to many different calendars. So when we think about Christian attempts to structure how they inhabit time, from a very, very early time, we can see that we can see Christians doing the same kind of thing. And at whatever time we pick, we also see Christians subject to these same kinds of pressures, right? Not being, do I need to say, not being able to fundamentally control time? Yeah, can't do that. So instead, trying to figure out how can they structure how they inhabit time. And we can think about this primarily on three levels. I'm going to say just a little bit about this by way of introduction before I get into my two examples, okay? When we think about early Christian attempts to structure how they inhabit time, we can think of it primarily on three levels: daily, weekly, and yearly. So just a couple of words about each of these as kind of like a reminder. These are things I think you already know. We sort of like bring them to active memory. So daily, this is primarily as it relates to the practice of daily prayer. And that's one of the topics we'll be spending some time on today. Weekly, this is primarily as it relates to the observance of Sunday worship. Welcome, you all here. Exactly. But interestingly, not only on Sundays. Already by the end of the first century, there is evidence that at least some Christians identified particular days of the week as days set aside for fasting, and therefore also for prayer and introspection and so on, specifically Wednesday and Friday. So if you're familiar with the Friday fast or even the Friday fish fry, the sort of like origins of this go all the way back to the first century, actually. So that's daily, weekly, and then yearly. Of course, the earliest yearly celebration is Easter. But by at least the 4th century, the Christian calendar had already developed other annual observations, other annual feasts or festivals, including a celebration of the birth of Jesus, which we, of course, know as Christmas. Side note, yeah, it's way later than Easter. So it's a whole other thing. Broadly speaking, these annual festivals are of two kinds. Those related in some way to the life of Jesus, Easter, Christmas, but also Ascension, Pentecost, and so on, and the days that commemorated the martyrs, who, incidentally, were usually celebrated on the anniversary of their deaths rather than on their births. So this is all just sort of background. From very early, Christians sought to structure how they experience an inhabited time, or in other words, to develop a distinctly Christian rhythm of time. And they did it on at least 3 levels: daily, weekly, yearly. So I'd like for us then to spend the rest of our time this morning looking at a couple of particular ways that they did that at a couple of particular times. And the first of these is the ways in which they sought to develop a daily rhythm of prayer. And particularly where we're going to land on this as an Episcopalian is with morning and evening prayer. But I'll get to that in a minute. So early Christians sought, I'm going to stop along the way, so like you have questions or comments or responses, I'll stop every now and then just to check in, okay? So early Christians sought to give order and rhythm to their days by ways of frequent, brief prayer. And this seems to have been in part a way to make sense of the day itself in light of their faith in God, and to see the day and its rhythms, the coming of the sun, the coming of darkness, waking, sleeping, and so on, as a sign of God's power and also as a sign of God's presence. To think of this as a kind of like way to make sense of the day itself. But it was also, or soon became, a way to try and keep the scriptural command to pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Or as one author has put it, to live into the shared Christian vocation to constant prayer. Now, this verse ends up having a very, very prominent role in the history of Christianity, especially as it pertains to daily rhythms of prayer. Over the centuries, Christians have spent a lot of time and effort, and some fighting occasionally, as it were, trying to find different ways to do precisely this, to pray without ceasing. Okay? We're not going to cover all those ways, but this is operating in the background. All right. This idea for us, as we're thinking about this today, and for them over the ages, over the centuries, rattling around with this kind of like, whoa, what does pray without ceasing? How would one do that? And sometimes they think about this in kind of like an internal sense. You might think of this as a kind of like prayerful attitude. This is one of the ways that they think about this, but that's not the only way. They're also thinking about how can we pray throughout the day in a more literal kind of way. Now, the earliest there are a number of ancient references, both Christian and non-Christian, to early Christians praying at certain times as they're trying to sort of like sort out this pattern. These include both Christian references, as early as in the Acts of the Apostles, and pagan references, for those of you that are interested, for example, in the letters of the Roman governor Pliny. Now, to summarize what is a complex and varied situation and evidence that like we don't need to go into the details of this morning, there's a general pattern that seems to emerge in the earliest centuries, or actually rather a kind of like two patterns that get smushed together, all right? And this is a kind of like 3+2 pattern, all right? So the first part is a pattern of prayer 3 times a day. The exact times could vary somewhat from place to place. There's no internet, there are no atomic clocks, they're not exactly in exact agreement, okay? But the pattern was prayers at roughly morning, noon, and late afternoon or evening, something like the Roman equivalents of 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m., or to put it in the actual Roman terms, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, and the 9th hour. This is kind of how they kept time. These were also, by the way, important moments in the Roman day, in much the way that sort of like the beginning of the workday is an important day, the end of the workday. Now, these 3 prayers would have typically been recitations of the Lord's Prayer, right? I said frequent, brief prayer, recitations of the Lord's Prayer, possibly with additional personal petitions. Say the Lord's Prayer, and then, add a little bit more. What is going on in this person's life? What are they asking for? And so on. These 3 times daily prayers were, in a sense, communal prayers. So in other words, what I mean by this is that they were at particular times of the day in a particular community. They were shared times at which all Christians, wherever they were physically, were expected to stop and pray. So there'd be whatever kind of like public announcement. It's the 3rd hour, right? Oh, time to pray. So 3 daily. They weren't necessarily gathering at church or something. Actually, this predates probably church buildings. Okay. But they were sort of like doing this at the same time, doing a thing together, even if they weren't physically together. Now, in addition to this first pattern of 3 was a second pattern of prayer upon waking up and going to sleep. Now, these were not communal in the same sense because, of course, people wake up at different times. People go to bed at different times, right? So this is more of an expectation of their own sort of personal rhythm of the day. This is how we get to a pattern of 3 plus 2. 3 sort of like quasi-communal prayers, 2 upon waking and sleeping. Now, in addition to this 3 plus pattern, there's also evidence of prayers at meals, this expectation developing also very early, and prayers in the middle of the night if one awoke. This is sidebar. So this is actually a pretty common thing in the pre-modern world, before cell phones, before artificial light, when rhythms were more on a rhythm of the natural day. There was a kind of idea of a first sleep and a second sleep, and it was sort of like a normal thing to wake up in the middle of the night. And so there's an expectation that developed like, oh, if you do wake up in the middle of the night, you should also pray then. Okay. So this is our earliest picture of how Christians in the first couple of centuries, already sought to give a particularly religious and Christian rhythm to their day, and to live into the Apostle Paul's command again to pray without ceasing as best they could. Now we're going to jump ahead quite a bit now. Okay, this is sort of I want you all to have a sense of this earliest period. See, as far back as our evidence goes, we're talking about sacred rhythms. Okay, as far back as our evidence goes, as far back as we have Christian sources, we see Christians doing this already. Okay, now I saw a hand. This is a moment. Pause for some questions. Yes. So this is an excellent question. And what I would suggest, I was thinking about whether to make this connection, so thank you for doing so. It's not coming from that. It's because our timing is off. So here we're talking about like 1st and 2nd and 3rd century, all right? And Islam does not rise for several hundred years after this, okay? Instead, they're both coming out of a kind of like what we call this is a late antique period. So they're both coming out of this period and a kind of like same kind of like Mediterranean and like Southwestern Asia, in the same part of the world. And so a kind of like, yes, in this period, what I just described should sound a lot like what to this day happens in Muslim communities. Now, eventually Christians go on a different path. We're going to look at a couple of examples of this. So what's happening is that they're both developing in a similar milieu, a similar context. And so they're developing similar kinds of prayers. Christians kind of take this in a different direction, and Muslims have continued this, have continued with the same kind of practice, if that makes sense. Does that help? Yes? Yeah, so I mean, this is again about trying to like think about excellent question, like historical imagination. So people are going to be out at different places during the day. So if they were home, it might be with their families, but this is again how Muslims today have to sort of figure out how to do this. Here you are at work, it's noon. All right, so you stop at your work day or wherever you're at and sort of pray. So it's not necessarily going to be in this earliest period at a kind of like church building. It's also not necessarily going to be with your family, because you might not be at home. right? So talking about these as brief informal prayers, there's not like a book that they're reading from. There's not a long, complicated sort of like liturgy or order of worship. They're stopping, they're saying the Lord's Prayer, they're maybe elaborating a little bit, then they're going back on with their day. Very good. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead. We're going to jump ahead actually a lot. Just like 1,000 years or so. Okay. To get to kind of what I want to focus on here. Okay. We're going to jump ahead to medieval Europe, and what we see that happens eventually, there's a long and complicated history. Again, we're going to skip over that for today's purposes. I'm going to connect with something that those of you that have been coming to these sessions regularly, this will sound at least a little bit familiar. A pattern develops in Western Europe, at least, that comes to be known as praying the hours, or more formally, the office, or the divine office is actually what it comes to be called, sort of more formally. Now, my understanding, you talked about this a little bit in previous times. It sounded at least a little bit familiar to some of you. Very good. I'm not going to, so this is why I'm sort of touching base here before we move on to the next thing, but I'll say a little bit for those of you that have slept since then or thought about other things, maybe you weren't here that week, okay? So there were 8 offices or hours of prayer in the medieval European church, okay? So we've gone from a kind of like 3 + 2 kind of pattern to a pattern of 8. So the first of these was before dawn, just before dawn, then one at dawn, one at the first hour, and here we pick up the sort of like the 3 part of the 3 + 2 sounds familiar. The 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour. Okay, so we're some parallels. One at sunset, roughly, or evening, and then another one right before sleep. Okay, so this is the pattern. This sort of like, and this I think is the pattern that you all would have touched on before. This is a pattern that takes a lot of time to develop. There are variations on it. This is a sort of like, as a historian, I have to say, like, I'm contractually obligated to say this is a very complex situation. For our purposes, though, we have 8 hours, okay? And we see here already, of course, we've jumped over a lot of time, but we see here a number of changes from this earliest period that we were just talking about, okay? And I'm going to highlight 3. First, there are a lot more. We would go from a 3 + 2 to now 8. All right, so even if we count this prayer in the middle of the night, that's still only 6. Now we're up to 8. Second, even more than that, these are no longer simple recitations of the Lord's Prayer. Okay, these hours have turned into a whole kind of, forgive me, production. All right, they're much more involved. They're now longer services of prayer that include multiple components. All right, the details are different in different locations, but the version of this that comes to be the most common and the most influential is from the Benedictines. And the Benedictine offices involve praying the Psalms. And I say praying the Psalms, I mean, they go through all the Psalms every week. So you can start to do the math on this, how many Psalms every day. They go through all 150 Psalms every week. So praying the Psalms, readings from other scripture texts and potentially other texts as well, singing hymns, and then also including other kinds of like responses, sung and spoken, scripture sentences, and so on. So all of that 8 times a day. Some of them were longer, some of them were shorter, but all of that 8 times a day. So that's the second. So first, they're more frequent. Second, they're longer. And third, as you might start to be wonder or might remember, these longer hours or offices of prayer are now not imagined or designed to be particularly individual prayer. Right? This kind of like sung and responses and so forth, these are ideally done in groups or communities. Okay? Now, this practice of praying the hours, or in other words, the divine office, was hugely important in medieval Christianity and also hugely influential. Okay. And also, as some of you may be thinking or wondering, it was real hard to do. Degree of difficulty went way up. Now, anybody wondering at all how medieval Christians were able to pull this off? They mostly weren't, okay? Or rather, not all of them were, okay? So this was a practice that was developed in and made the most sense in a monastic context. It was mostly monks that were doing this, okay? In most monasteries in the medieval period, this was the main thing they did. This was, in a certain sense, the work that they did for their communities, for the church, and for the world. The scriptures had commanded us to pray without ceasing. And for most of us with jobs, that's like hard. And so the monks had taken this task on themselves, that they would pray for the whole community, kind of. Think of this what you will, but this is how they understood it. So their whole day was organized around it, and it was every day. Their whole rhythm of life, right? Their whole kind of sacred rhythm was organized around these hours. But it was such a highly valued practice that eventually, that's how this goes, not only monks were expected to do it. Eventually, it kind of expands out. Like, this is the good thing. The monks are doing it. All y'all should do this. And, that introduced a series of problems. Okay. I'll say more about, we okay questions so far? Are we doing? Yes. Absolute. This. Exactly. Absolutely. Sure. There's a power element here. Yeah. Interestingly, I mean, like that does develop in some sorts of places. It's not, but and this is certainly how later reformers come to talk about it for sure. Although how it develops is mostly the monks often think of it as a kind of, and this is language that might be more or less comfortable for the folks in this room, as a kind of spiritual warfare, right? Like they're praying for themselves, but for the world and for the community. So they're like doing a work. And in fact, one of the other languages, the word for this, it's Latin opus Dei, but it means they're doing the work of God. So they understand themselves actually to be like sort of on their knees for the community in a way, although it does take on these other, like it takes on other kinds of resonances as well. So one of the challenges is not only this, Protestants eventually come to have these kinds of questions about it for sure, but more than that, the pattern of daily offices is a beautiful one, but also a difficult one to practice outside of a monastic context. Or at the very least, this is the experience of many of the Reformation era clergy. So by the late Middle Ages, it comes to be expected that not only monks, but also clergy would keep the daily office. That stuff. In addition to the pastor things they had to do, right? So, and on the whole, those who genuinely tried to fulfill this expectation found it difficult and burdensome. Martin Luther, for example, describes at some point how he, like many other people, would sort of like understood it as an obligation, but you ever taken on a discipline and then like not able to keep it all up? He would miss them, but keep track of all the ones that he had missed. Like he was busy working, busy doing all the stuff that he did, and then he would sort of like have a makeup day, take a whole day and just do like a week's worth or two or whatever of just like all day. Right. This is clearly not in the spirit of things. He also found it to be like bad, but so this is like, it was not working is what I'm saying, right? Once people were trying to take this on, recognizing the beauty and power of it, but also like trying to take it on in a context that didn't work for them, it became a problem. Okay. So the problem was widely recognized. It wasn't just like Protestants or, some fairly irascible figures like Luther. It was a widely recognized problem. And for example, in 1529, so we're now talking about the 16th century, the Pope authorized the creation of a new prayer book to try to like make this workable. It came out, it was very popular, but also it was very controversial. You can imagine trying to change a hugely important and popular practice. Exactly how that goes every single time. Yeah. So it was popular for about 30 years and then it got banned. So this is a thing in the Reformation era that they were trying to do. Okay. This desire to reform the traditional hours of prayer was actually one of the many, many things that were objects of reform in this period, both for Catholics and Protestants. So, and they were also a focus of reform in the Reformation, including in the English Reformation. So we often think about the Reformation as being, as Protestants, we often think about the Reformation as being primarily about like the primacy of Scripture and the doctrine of justification by faith, like this kind of stuff. It was, but it was also very much about changes in how people worshiped and in how they prayed. Trying to reform the offices of prayer was actually right on the list of like Protestant stuff that they were trying to deal with. Okay, even if it's not the stuff that we lead with. The reformers sought to change the daily office, and hear me now, and so to change the rhythm and shape of daily prayer. And one place where this came to be especially important was in England. So this is the part, I'm Episcopalian, so landing this part of the story, and then we'll switch and talk to the other side of it. But the first English prayer book was published in 1549, and one of its main features. It's called the Book of Common Prayer. Yeah, one of its main features was revised offices of daily prayer. This is what they're trying to do. This is a picture of the cover, the title page of the 1549 first edition of the Book of Common Prayer. So, as Protestants, the English reformers revised the office, as many people wanted to revise the office in this period, but they did it in particular ways, Protestant ways, English Protestant ways. So first, they wanted to create daily prayer offices that were not only for the clergy, but also for the laity, for everybody. Of course, saying the offices had been a monastic practice, and then later a monastic and clerical clergy practice, and the reformers wanted it to be for everybody, not just clergy and monastics. So this desire led to several choices. It had been in Latin; they translated it to English. Instead of having 8 offices a day, they condensed these into just 2 offices. All right. So they combined several offices and they cut out some other offices and just reworked. They didn't make them from scratch. They took the 8 hours and transformed them into 2 hours. Once in the morning and once in the evening. They changed from trying to do all the Psalms in 1 week to all the Psalms in a month. But again, the same idea, trying to pray through the Psalms. They're not like throwing it all out. They're trying to transform it. And in order to keep things simple and easy to use, they're not trying to connect them to specific days, right? Like we're in the 5th Sunday, the 6th Sunday of Lent. So it goes, this psalm goes with this day. It had gotten to the point that it took so many different books to pray the daily hour. You needed the hymn book, you needed the Bible, you needed the book of prayers, you needed the book of Psalms, you needed one of the English reformers said, by the time you had gathered all the books and figured out all the places that you needed to turn to, you had spent more time getting your books ready than you would actually spend praying. And so they're trying to make it simple so that actually people can use it. So these are all a series of choices that they're making to restructure the rhythm of daily prayer. The second principle they were committed to was the centrality of Scripture. Shocking, I know. And this led to the choice that each office had substantial readings from the Bible specifically. And so the biblical passages get longer. So what to this day, Anglicans, Episcopalians, also Presbyterians, we'll come back to that in a second, have these offices of morning and evening prayer. And these are a continuation, the thread runs all the way back to these first centuries of trying to figure out and to provide for the Christian community a rhythm of daily prayer and how to structure it. They come out of a desire to reform this 8 hours of the day and turn it into something that the whole Christian community can use. In this case, for the English Protestants, it's a rhythm of prayer focused on an orderly recitation of the Psalms, working your way all the way through, and reading of the Bible. You do the whole thing, you do it every day, you'll go through the Psalms every month, and you'll go through more or less the whole Bible every year. So we have English Protestants transforming one of the key ways that medieval Christians, some of them, had organized their days into a rhythm of prayer, and doing so in ways that were particularly adapted to an early modern Protestant English-speaking context, focused on Scripture and on the active participation of the laity in English. That transformation has continued to reverberate down to today. Although the Anglican or Episcopal versions of this have not worked out exactly as the Reformers had hoped, they wanted the laity and everybody to come to church twice a day for morning prayer and evening prayer, and that part hasn't really worked out. And actually, they figured out within the first generation that wasn't working out the way they had wanted it to. That's another story. Nevertheless, it still plays a major role in how Anglicans and Episcopalians and others seek to have a particularly Christian rhythm of time And in our own time, it continues to adapt. And so I just give a couple examples of how this is. Two particular ways common now, just in the last 5 years, in other words, post-COVID, um, lots of local Episcopal congregations do morning prayer, sometimes evening prayer, but mostly morning prayer, and live stream this thing on Facebook. So we think back to the very early thing of like, oh, people doing this, they're not all physically going to the same place, but stopping wherever they are, and now having a kind of like digital mechanism for trying to figure out how to observe this communally, but not exactly communally, trying to do the same kind of thing. Or secondly, these are the top two are podcasts. The third one is an app that has both the text and the audio, but same kind of thing, right? So like, are you in the same place? No. Are you doing it individually? Also not exactly no, right? Like a kind of like semi-communal thing. So again, trying to find ways in this culture to continue, but also adapt this sort of like pattern or sacred rhythm. I'm gonna stop. I've got a second thing, the Presbyterian side of this I'll do in a moment, but questions, comments, or responses before we move on? Please. Say more. Mhm. Yeah. Sure, of course. Yeah. Absolutely. I'll say two things here. This is, of course, the one of the versions of this question that Christians have asked themselves over the centuries, precisely when they're, among other things, I say as a historian, when their own practice or the practice of those around them no longer makes sense. They look around like, this can't be right. And so this is one of the ways they say, like, we've got to rethink this. So yes, for this tradition of things, they understood themselves to also be asking this. And I've been focused on the kind of like rhythm part of it and not on this kind of like in the moment kind of like, this is not to the in the moment kind of like constant prayer, sort of like as a sort of posture or attitude of prayer. This is not meant as a kind of like this instead of that. Rather, most folks understood that the two things are connected in some way, that we can't expect to have a constant in the moment sense of prayer if we don't also have some sort of rhythm of sort of explicit embodied prayer. And that's how they tended to think about it, though, of course, sometimes that broke down. Sometimes that connection fell apart, of course. Yes, please. Yes, exactly. Yes, although now they've kind of like split into two things. Yeah. And so you'll recall that I said that the hope, the goal of the reformers was for this to be a corporate service where folks actually went to church. And so the evensong, if you think like, I go to the cathedral downtown, and so like we will occasionally have an evensong. Y'all are welcome. It's beautiful. But like, so if you go to something like this is something like what they imagined, although it's a very sort of elaborate version of it. And so a kind of, you think of this like, one way you can think of this again is as a kind of like a sacrifice of praise, an offering of praise. All right. So that goes in one direction, but this goes in a kind of like, this version is like the book itself, the prayer book itself has no songs. It doesn't have all the kind of like musical sort of part of it. So when they adopt morning and evening prayer, at first they just call evening prayer evensong. That's exactly it. That's what it is. Evening prayer is evensong. But then there come to be two different ways to sort of like inhabit or practice it. One, this corporate kind of way that involves lots of practice, involves choirs, it involves organs, right? Like, what do we do if we have all of those resources, say at a cathedral, versus what do we do if we're at home or we're in a small parish church or I'm saying this myself? Is that, yeah, of course. All right, I'm going to keep moving then. Oh, that was that slide. There we go. All right. So the second thing here we've been looking at a daily pattern or rhythm and how that changed over time. For our second example, I'm going to look at a different kind of rhythm, something closer to a yearly rhythm, although not quite. Specifically drawing our attention to something maybe less well known. I'm going to ask you about this in a second, and something that is absolutely particularly Presbyterian, something called sacramental seasons in early Presbyterianism. Anybody here already familiar with this? One or two head nods. All right, good. So mostly no. All right. So what are we talking about then? Broad, and here, always cite your sources. I'm relying on scholarship from by somebody else. The book is called Holy Fairs, Scotland and the Making of American Revivalism. Somebody by a scholar by the name of Lee Eric Schmidt. Okay. Now, broadly speaking, sacramental seasons were multi-day events that were focused on the celebration of the Eucharist or Lord's Supper, Holy Communion. Okay. In early Presbyterianism, early Presbyterian Christianity. They became a popular practice in the 17th century, so in other words, the 1600s, and remained so until about the middle of the 19th century. They began in Scotland, shocking, but also became very important in the United States as well. This is the overview. I'll give you some more details. It's the details that are interesting, but that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, okay? So, as I've already said, there was a great deal of conflict in the Reformation era, focused on worship and liturgy. And this was particularly true in Scotland, where much of the conflict in this period was focused on communion or the Eucharist. Okay. Much of the drive for change to the existing practice, what we might anachronistically call Catholic practice, came from people committed to Reformed theology and practice. All right. Again, more Protestants. All right. These folks wanted some common themes here. They wanted more lay participation. They wanted communion to be more of an actual collective meal. All right. And for that meal to reflect a broader sense of social togetherness and sharing. They wanted people to actually sit down across from one another and share some kind of meal at communion. Okay. And this togetherness to actually be reflected in the theology and the worship and so on. Right? And they wanted to, hear me now, and they wanted, this is what, when I say sit down together, this is an image of it, okay? So communion service, line up the tables. I'll come back to this in a second. And they wanted to limit participation in communion to those who had prepared spiritually and who had repented of their sins. You might recall that the Apostle Paul talks about not taking communion if you are unworthy. They took that very seriously or wanted to. Okay. So in other words, these are like very serious changes that lots of stuff going on, but for our purposes this morning, changes that sought to change the rhythm and the practice of the medieval mass or communion into a very different kind of rhythm and practice. Okay. So into this particular cultural moment stepped evangelical Scottish Presbyterians with a new form of doing this. Like, here we go. We have an idea. This is how we think we should do this. And this thing has come to be called sacramental seasons. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, okay? So, a little description of the ritual. This is from one particular source, but this is a kind of like overview of how it would typically work. An announcement would go out that they'd be celebrating communion. This announcement was made. They did not do this every week, okay? So hear me out. This is not an every week kind of thing, all right? They'd send out an announcement. Communion is going to happen. This announcement would be several weeks in advance because you needed to prepare. All right. During the weeks leading up to the event, the pastor would go about examining candidates to receive communion. It was always he, wanted to know, were they qualified to receive communion? Did they have a sound knowledge of the doctrines of the faith? Did they understand the meaning of the sacrament? Did they have an experience of grace? How were they living? Were they living godly lives? This was not a perfunctory conversation. Okay, this is a serious process. Now, you can already start to see things have changed, I think. I'm just going to guess, okay? Preparation became more intense as time for communion approached. People gathered from all around, so this wasn't just at a local church, like people would travel and come to this. And maybe like about a week and a half before the actual celebration of communion, things really picked up. They had a special meeting of prayer and instruction. Then on the Sunday, the week before, there were 2 full services I don't mean one or the other. You went to both of them. Devoted to preaching on and explaining the Lord's Supper. The next Wednesday, here we go, Wednesdays again, interesting. The next Wednesday was a communal day of fasting and repentance, which was also combined with like personal introspection and recommitment. And then they had 2 more days continued as days of worship, prayer, examination, meditation, personal recommitment, all this happening on like a family level. Okay. So here, like we got like 2 weeks leading up just to take communion. You understand the kind of what's happening? Okay. Then on the day before communion itself, Saturday, there was another public service of preaching and worship. And one aspect of this service was that during the service, it was explained, I say it was explained, passive voice, the pastor explained, who would be participating in communion and who would not. This included handing out tokens to those who were eligible to participate. All right. These tokens would be given back the next day in order to receive communion. Had you prepared? Were you ready? Did you understand what you were doing or not? If so, you get a token and you get to participate. If not, no. The traditional word for this in English is fencing the table. Fencing. Yeah, so like putting a fence around, like, and there's a long and controversial history to this day about this issue. That's a long, like, this is another conversation. But so the question is always, in a large community, how in the world do you do this? This is them trying precisely to do this, right? The whole like leading up to it, getting a token, having to give it back. Yes, I am eligible to participate. On Sunday, the space was carefully prepared. Tables were arranged and joined together, covered with clean linen. And in the center, I didn't bring my laser pointer here, but just in the center, just in front of the pulpit, was placed a table with the sacramental bread and wine. You can see here. So that table, yes, but then all the other tables as well. All right, there's a long exposition on the Lord's Supper, and then the pastor spoke very explicitly, again, about who participates and not, who can't, the ignorant, the unbelieving, the profane. They read the 10 Commandments, et cetera, et cetera. Then the worthy, the people with the tokens, are invited to come and sit at the tables. The pastor consecrates the bread and wine, partook, and then they passed it along to all seated at the tables, who also partook together, tearing the bread, sharing it with one another, sharing the cup with one another. This scene was repeated depending on how large the crowd was. These people would get up, leave, the next people would come, sit down. The same process is repeated. And then after that, more preaching, another like long sermon. Then more services afterwards that night and the next day. Afterwards, they're focused less on penitence and preparation and more on thanksgiving, which is what the word Eucharist means, by the way. And then finally, after all of that, the sacramental season ends. That's the kind of like somewhat detailed description. Okay. I want you to notice 2 things in particular about this. Okay. First of all, they were very carefully planned events. They had their own structure and their own, here's this word again, their own rhythm. All right. There was a way that they were expected to go. It was not by accident. All right. Everybody knew how early to show up, what would happen each day, what the themes would be, who could participate, how you're supposed to prepare. All of this was carefully planned out. Secondly, and maybe more interestingly for us, these sacramental seasons provided a rhythm of spiritual life for early Presbyterians, right? Not a daily one, but a kind of seasonal, right? They didn't only structure the week and a half or so that they were together. Oh, no. They were experienced as spiritually powerful events, and they structured the lives of the individuals in the churches that participated in them. So, for example, one early commentator on this reflects this idea, okay? After his church called a new pastor, he describes that the congregation had all faithfully attended Sunday services, right? They were all doing what they were supposed to do, but, quote, nothing very remarkable of a public nature, end quote, had happened at church. Everybody's coming to church, but it was kind of boring. It wasn't really spiritually refreshing. Nothing had really happened until, quote, until the sacrament. It was only at the sacramental season that there was a powerful and special experience of God in their experience. The sacramental seasons brought renewal and revival. And this particular church, they did it again 6 months later, then they did it again a year after that. All right? The same would have been true for other kinds of communities. All right. So this process of the sacramental seasons brought people through a series of transitions and or transformations, right? So think about this. This is what's happening. From penitence to thanksgiving, from repentance to new birth, from conversion to confirmation, from youth to adulthood, from their kind of like world, kind of like profane existence or mundane existence to a kind of like what they would have described kind of like to the gate of heaven. It was a condensation, a concentration of these spiritual transformations that made the sacramental seasons especially powerful. In this week and a half, it was a kind of compilation of the whole faith compressed into a few days. The center of this was the Lord's Supper, but this was expanded by all of their preparation for and response to. And so these sacramental seasons offered a pattern of life, a rhythm for early Presbyterian life and worship. They weren't understand simply ways to mix it up, like, oh, things are getting a little tired, let's do something different, have guitars instead of organ, right? Like do it earlier or later. This was not, no. The people involved understood them to be the spiritual high points of the community's life, and everyone knew it. Their success was not based on kind of like how unusual they were, but rather precisely on the rhythm of it, the predictability of it. People knew to prepare, they knew what to expect. It provided a more or less predictable rhythm of spiritual life. Events that were expected to have restorative effects that would last, even if the duration might vary from person to person. Okay. All right. And for those who wanted more or wanted to sort of like really prepare for this, of course, the way was through preparation by means of devotional disciplines. This was part of the process. That's what I mean. It wasn't just the week that was part of the rhythm, but this devotional preparation for it. So the seasons themselves, yes, were the kind of like communal center of it, but the people that were involved or committed to it, it was a rhythm for them precisely because of the devotional disciplines that they took on as a way to prepare for it. It underpinned the whole event and experience. Disciplines of self-examination, of what they would have called personal covenanting, secret prayer, meditation, devotional reading, and so on. These preparations often gave way to a more direct, you might say spiritual, we might say mystical, whatever, but a more direct encounter with Christ in the sacrament and in spiritual experiences at the sacramental seasons. These were not like eccentricities or weird things. These were part of the expected religious practice of these seasons. So they embodied the spiritual cycle of at least these early modern Presbyterian people, from spiritual deadness to repentance to joyous release, a pattern that's reenacted sort of in each of these sacramental seasons, and it becomes an essential part of Reformed and evangelical piety in this period. But it happened over and over, right? So the sacramental seasons marked the high days of the spiritual life of this people, a kind of holy season, a kind of part of their sacred rhythm. All right, pause for a minute. You got a question? Yeah, so you saw that this would often happen outside because this was too big of a thing for it to be inside. And it's an excellent question. I've been focusing on, shall we say, the folks who came with their devotional disciplines prepared and ready to go. But actually, these were things that lots of other people would participate in. And so the book that I said this comes from is called Holy Fairs. And they had both the character of a kind of like, we might say revival, though that is actually a different thing, but also the character of a kind of like public festival. So a lot of people would come, and they were not terribly bothered that they weren't prepared for the spiritual part of it. They were still there for the fun. They were still there for to see everybody. They were still there for the other stuff. So there were other things going on around. So, I mean, obviously, obviously going to be some people perhaps who came to participate and didn't get to participate, and that's not going to be a happy experience for them. But there were also people who, were just there for the fun. Yes, please. I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think it's hard to answer in the abstract. So in other words, what I mean is that like, if you take on a discipline where you know there's the possibility that you might not complete this discipline, you take on a new task of whatever kind, right? And it doesn't work for you. You don't complete it, right? So is this, and someone else tells you you did not complete this. We go to the category, I think rightly, it's good to ask, is this a shaming thing? But there's a difference between saying, do I feel ashamed about something I did? Or is someone else trying to shame me? And that I think is a complicated, actually kind of dynamic that in the abstract, like we're talking about this morning, I couldn't possibly really answer. I would imagine whenever there are power dynamics involved, then this is going to happen sometimes. I think the question would really be like how frequently, and I don't have an answer for that this morning. Is that? Yeah, I don't think that they like published lists of names like that, but you would see who got tokens and didn't. I mean, that part you would see. Yeah. Yes, that part, the visibility of it. This is what I'm saying, right? Right? You didn't make it. And then also, was there any competitive alternatives? Gary figured out for himself. I'm never going to make the bars clean. Was there another Christian faith? I mean, the Catholic Church. Well, I mean, yeah, so this is an interesting question, and I'm not going to be able to offer full like answers to this, but these are exactly the right kinds of questions. So in other words, as we're trying to imagine what is this like, this is exactly it. And like you can think about this, this isn't everybody. This is not, as you say, the only game in town, right? So the people that are choosing to participate these are, as I said, these are like evangelical Presbyterians in this time. And so the people that are coming to this are people already who are like choosing to come to an evangelical Presbyterian thing. Like they're signing on. I said this is about predictability. People know how it works. People knows what is expected of them. Okay. So when you think this is the context, right? Like I'm choosing to do this thing. I'm choosing to be a part of this community. I don't have to be a part of this community necessarily, broadly speaking. And so this is right. Like I'm trying to accomplish something. I'm trying to live into this piety. I'm trying to live into this holiness. I'm trying to live into this devotion or discipline, like depending on the kind of language that you all use. All right. So this is like, could it be shaming? It could be, but also like we need structure. Like many of us find that we need structure in order to do hard things, in order to advance, in order to. So like we have to think about it in both of these ways, right? And people, I think, to say, would have experienced it in both these ways, right? The individual experiences would vary. Yes. Well, I mean, there is the doctrinal part of this, but this is not how they're imagining it, I guess is what I would say. Is like on the contrary, like are you prepared to receive communion or not? Right? In other words, like it's not in the abstract. It's not about are you part of the elect, and none of us could ever know. It is, did you prepare yourself for this or not? And that's something you can do something about. There is exactly a fierceness to it. That's right. Sure, of course. I mean, what I want to say is that this is a practice that died out. I mean, I'm not here telling you this is what you should do. I mean, like, y'all don't do this now. So I mean, like, okay, this is a very, and intentionally so, use the word fierce. We might say intense, right? But it's also very public. Okay. This is a pre-enlightenment, right? Early modern form of this. All right. Long before any of us were born, religion in the West took a kind of like more individual and private turn. All right. And so we think of anything that's not private in this way, our category for it is judgmental. I'm not trying to say, but I'm just saying, like, so this is maybe not fair, but like, oh, I'll give you a second. But what I'm trying to say here is that like they're trying to do a thing in which a thing that none of us may be comfortable with. I don't want to speak for all you, but like I think it's fair to be like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm worried about shaming. I'm worried about judgmentalism. All these I think are perfect, like absolutely fair kinds of things. But they have not yet. They are not yet in a cultural context that is concerned about those in the same kind of way. They're trying to embrace this because they're trying to make visible, to go back to the elect thing, right? Like, wait a minute, who are the real Christians and not? This should be a hard and fierce kind of thing is what they want, whether that's what we want, that's what they want. And so they're like, oh, there has to be some amount of accountability. We can't just be like, you know, if you think you're ready to take communion this morning, come on up. From their perspective, they're like, no. They're trying to do the opposite of that. Right, wrong, indifferent, whether we like it or not. That's this is, again, I'm talking about this is a thing that happens in their particular kind of context, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. So there's absolutely judgment involved. For them, if I can use this phrase, the judgment, or even we say judgmentalism, is a feature and not a bug. It's what they want. Later, we move away from that. Yeah. Sure, of course. I'm aware of the time. So this is what happens. This is kind of like trying to get from here to there. These things die off. Okay. They die off in the 19th century. And let me give you 3 examples of ways in which they give way to new cultural contexts, is the way that I put it on here. In other words, the culture changes and suddenly these things don't make sense anymore. Things that they thought of as features, as positives, start to look bad. All right. 3 examples. One I already mentioned about the Enlightenment. All right. So this is way too public. It's not nearly kind of like rationally oriented, too much focused on experience and not enough on kind of rationality, and also too much festivity. Right? No. Okay. Okay. See, there you go. Your comment, not mine. Also in this period, the rise of what we might call middle-class culture. In other contexts, we might talk about like Victorian culture, or if you like this sort of term, bourgeois culture. But the rise of middle-class culture, and from a middle-class, kind of like what we would say upper middle-class perspective, the holy fairs take too much time, and therefore they cost too much. I got to be back home making money, like doing my job, contributing to the economy, etc. They're excessively, again, too festive, right? Like religion should be more dignified and a little more public, a little more kind of like orderly and a little more private, right? And way too enthusiastic, all right? Over time, this kind of like middle-class culture seeks to privatize religion and make it more orderly, right? Less rambunctious, less boisterous, a little more on my personal beliefs, a little more respectable. And again, good, bad, indifferent is what happens beginning in the 19th century, okay? Thirdly, oh, no, one back. In an American culture, this looks a lot like American revivalism. This is part of what the book is about that I mentioned. These are kind of like forerunners of revivalism, but they are not the same. There are lots of similarities, and they are kind of forerunners, but one of the key tenets of American revivalism is that innovation. This is a popular theme even to this day, and that's when we start to see it. You can do what you want with that. But in revivals, it's about innovation, all right? Always give them something new. Always mix things up. Don't let it get boring. You have got to keep people's attention. So you're constantly mixing things up. And so they're still aiming for this kind of like religious experience. But in the sacramental seasons, it's about predictability. It's about rhythm. It's about preparation. How do I prepare myself spiritually and religiously to have this religious experience at Holy Communion? In the revivals, it's about something new, innovation, keeping their attention. And so in America, it moves from these sacramental seasons among Presbyterians to, among some Presbyterians, but not all, an embrace of kind of like revivalism. So these things, and then others, like we exist in a very different cultural context, as you said. And so like, it's about trying to understand this was a rhythm of life for them, right? Did it make sense to them? Doesn't mean it has to make sense to us. So I know kind of we're at time here. We've been doing questions already. So let me simply say, as way of conclusion, so both of these practices, the formation of morning and evening prayer out of the divine office and the sacramental seasons, these are particular ways in which faithful Christians at particular times and places in particular cultures, none of which are ours, sought to live into a sacred rhythm of life, a rhythm that was fitted to those cultural contexts and those historical contexts. Neither of these practices continued unchanged, sidebar. No practice does. And among many other possible reflections, I hope this helps us all notice the importance of keeping sacred time, but also reflect on the ways in which doing so is necessarily adapted to the cultural and religious context in which we actually live. Right? Only thus, it seems to me, can such rhythms contribute to the vibrancy of our spiritual lives. I'll end there. Thank you all for your attention.